theme of this week's seminar is Britain as a Warfare State. Now, that is the title of a book published by the historian David Edgerton almost a decade ago now. But why do we tend to focus more on Britain as a welfare state and less as a warfare state?
Yes, well, I suppose the term welfare state is something that's been very closely associated with particularly the idea of a post-war consensus in British politics in the 1940s to 1970s. It's something that's either celebrated or used as a term of criticism. But yes, this idea of warfare state is something which is more rarely used and is more controversial. In some ways, perhaps this goes back to some of the literature which emerges after Two Cultures controversy in the 1960s.
Yeah, well, it's worth saying a little bit about that controversy, perhaps. So if we hold up to the camera this copy of C.P. Snow's famous lecture on the Two Cultures. I mean, what Snow was saying was that there was a big divide between the culture of the sciences and the culture of the arts, and he saw this was a major problem, furthermore a major problem that was getting worse and that was linked to Britain's relative decline.
Yeah, so it's obviously a very well-used copy of Two Cultures. So, yes, Two Cultures is based on a lecture that Snow gives in 1959. He's an interesting figure. I suppose today he'd be referred to as a public intellectual, has a background in the sciences, and is a technocrat. So, yes, Snow very much sees British civil service and other British elites as being too dominated by the humanities and neglecting sciences and research and development compared to its foreign competitors. And this is a criticism which gains a lot of sympathy in the 1960s, particularly from figures who were involved in the New Left, like Perry Anderson and Tom Nenn.
Yeah, and it's maybe something that we can actually see, this idea of the two cultures, maybe we can actually see that in Yes Minister. We have Sir Humphrey, the Oxbridge-educated classicist, and we have Jim Hacker, who went to the London School of Economics, and is baffled by many of the sort of the Latin tags that Humphrey drops into conversation.
Same name with meta stuck on the front.
That makes all the difference.
Why? What does meta mean?
What does meta mean, Humphrey?
Oh, it's quite simple. It means with or after, or sometimes beyond. It's from the Greek, of course.
Of course.
In other words, with or after Dachshund, sometimes beyond Dachshund. It depends whether it's the accusative or the genitive. With the accusative, it's beyond or after. With the genitive, it's with. As in Latin, of course, as you no doubt obviously recall, where the ablative is used for words needing a sense of with to precede them.
But of course, there isn't an ablative in Greek, is there?
Well done, Bernard.
Thank you.
So we have this discourse of the two cultures in the 1960s, but how does that play out later on in the 1980s, for example?
Yes, so around the time that Yes Minister was being produced, there's a lot of debates about the role of elites in British society. So Corelli Barnett, an interesting figure on the left, produces a series of books beginning with The Audit of War during the Thatcher years, which criticise British elites, again, for being overly focused on the humanities. So in some ways what we're seeing in the 1980s is the debates of the 60s being played out again at a time in which the role of the state in British life has been questioned dramatically.
Now, Barnett is an interesting figure in a way because, as you say, he's somebody who is in favour of much greater state intervention and much more state investment in industry. But actually he's picked up by Mrs Thatcher and Keith Joseph in the 1980s because of his criticism of what he sees as excessive welfare spending, the so-called New Jerusalemism, as he puts it. But nonetheless, both his work and Snow's indeed has come under much criticism from historians, notably Edgerton. So in a sense, what is Edgerton's critique of these earlier types of ideas?
Well, I mean, Barnett in some ways can be seen as critiquing the emergence of a welfare state under Labour in the late 1940s, and argues that this was at the expense of spending on science and defence. Whereas Edgerton argues that actually there's still very significant spending in Britain in the 1950s and 60s on issues of science and defence, and it's only really later on in the latter half of the 1960s that we kind of get the decline of this welfare state. So we have two very different viewpoints there, I think.
So what Edgerton is really saying is that actually, contrary to what he says is a myth, the British state was highly technologically and scientifically capable.
Yes, absolutely. That's very much at the heart of his arguments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, and the theme of this week's seminar is Britain as a warfare state.
Sorry, let's just carry on and I'll edit it down.